Next, from Chicago, Barry Cooper, the regional administrator of the Federal Aviation Administration's Great Lakes region, gives an address from the Union League Club of Chicago titled Invasion of the Drones, Our Safety and Privacy. This runs about 30 minutes.
You know, that was a very nice introduction and a very thorough one. I'm not sure how much my words can add to the overview you gave us here today, but I appreciate that. And I'm a little intimidated by the fact that you call me the foremost authority on anything in this world. But nonetheless, I will speak on behalf of the FAA, and I'm happy to do that. Thank you very much for the invitation. I appreciate being here. I'll keep my remarks short and focus more on the questions you might have. But I just wanted to cover a few things because this is a fascinating topic. It's a fascinating topic where technology is moving fast, and we all need to keep up with it. I think if we're going to talk about unmanned aircraft and how we deal with those things, drones as they're known, unmanned aircraft systems, I'll use the term UAS a lot today. I'm going to talk about, kind of start with the FAA mission. Our mission, in a sentence, is to establish and maintain the safest and most efficient aviation system in the world, and in fact, we do that. Our mission is generally defined by the laws that Congress passes, which authorizes our agencies to exist and perform its mission. But how we carry out the mission is defined by a set of rules and regulations and standards that our agency puts in place to help us appropriately regulate and support aviation in the United States. As you might expect, those rules and regulations and standards we have in place and have been in place for a long time have largely focused, as you might imagine, on traditional aviation, the traditional aircraft, registered aircraft pilot in the cockpit, and all the requirements that go with that. So you take that as the background, and now you insert unmanned aircraft systems into this equation. The UAS industry is here. We know it's here. We know it's growing fast. We know there's a lot of benefits and advantages that come from UAS technology. But with the arrival of UAS in recent years, it certainly brings about challenges to the FAA as regulators of our aviation system. Looking at that from an alternative perspective, if you look at it from the perspective of the UAS industry, the people who want to explore those opportunities to use UAS technology, much like you described in some of the things you talked about, from their perspective, they have the task of waiting patiently while the FAA creates rules and grants approvals and things like that to move forward with UAS. And I know that there's certainly a lot of interest on both sides to make sure we get this right. A little history about unmanned aircraft from our perspective. If you look back a few years, and it really hasn't been many years, if you talked about remotely piloted aircraft, unmanned aircraft, you're largely talking about a hobby industry where a person would acquire a remote control aircraft kit, and in their garage they would assemble that kit, and they would go out and fly it under hobby rules. A lot of them do it in flying clubs and things like that. So it's a very confined and predictable operation of remotely controlled aircraft under the hobbyist and their heading. And there are hobby rules that apply. The FAA has had those in place for a long time to dictate how hobbyists can fly those types of aircraft without interfering with the rest of the use of our airspace. So you look at today. Now in today's world, if I want to, I can leave here today, I can go to a department store, and if I have a nominal sum of money in my pocket, I can buy a remote-controlled aircraft that is far more capable than some of those things that were built in those folks' garage, and I can take it out of the box, and with maybe a glance at the instructions, I can send that thing higher and farther than maybe I should be. And that's what we're dealing with today, is kind of the explosion of that industry and the challenges that creates along the way. We also have, as I said, an arrival of a whole lot of commercial operators, industry people, entrepreneurs that want to use UAS in their business for very, very good purposes, and they're anxious to do so. So there are two primary challenges for FAA that we face right now. And one of them is the growing interest in commercial applications for unmanned aircraft, because those aircraft flying commercially can't operate under hobby rules. And secondly is what was talked about here, the non-commercial use of UAS by individuals operating well beyond the limits of hobby use and flying higher and farther and in places they shouldn't be. And we see that happening certainly in some of the things we see in the news. So what is FAA doing in terms of trying to take this on? We're doing a few different things, and I'm going to grossly oversimplify this, I will tell you in the time I have. But I want to talk about three things. I want to mention education, I want to mention rulemaking, and I want to mention research as we look to how UAS gets used in the future. Education, we start with education because I said we see a lot of use of UAS by people who are amateurs, who are not qualified to use it the way it's being used. And in a lot of cases, we see that as people just not being aware that there are rules that are involved in occupying our airspace with an unmanned aircraft. There are dangers that get created by aircraft flying in the wrong places, too close to airports, for instance, and things like that. And people just don't know. Many people just don't know. So we see education has a huge piece of that. So to the extent we can get education off the ground, we've tried to do that on a number of fronts. We have different programs. We have the Know Before You Fly program. It's a partnership with industry to get the information out, to educate users and potential future users of UAS on what they need to know, the operating rules, and where to get the knowledge they need to have. We have things like, we have one called the No Drone Zone initiative in the Washington, D.C. area specifically. You're right, we had a couple of incidents there where UAS wandered where it shouldn't be. So specifically in the D.C. area, we have a targeted outreach, educational outreach to try and get people's attention to understand where you can't fly in the D.C. area. There's a Before You Fly smartphone application. This is pretty cool. This is, you've got your smartphone, based on your location, the application can tell you where you can and can't go, what you can and can't do if you're flying an unmanned aircraft using your application. We have website information, a ton of website information out there that we've linked to a lot of different places to make it as widespread as possible. And we've even done some public service announcements, partnering with organizations like the NFL to try and get a big message out to as many people as possible to try and tell them what needs to be known. So that's a start. Let me turn my attention to rulemaking, because this is a big part of what the FAA does. Now, I talked about the current rules that were in place, the rules, the regulations, the standards that largely apply to traditional aviation, piloted aircraft and things like that. If you look at those rules, a lot of those rules goes to things like airworthiness of the aircraft and credentials of a pilot. And it's very difficult for an unmanned aircraft operator to fit into those rules and be able to have much room to work because the UAS world is different than the traditional aircraft world. The FAA Modernization Reform Act of 2012, our authorizing legislation, the last time it was passed was 2012, said a couple of things. One of the things it did was to direct the FAA to work toward integrating unmanned aircraft into civilian airspace and to get that process started once that legislation went into place. A sub-element of that is Section 333 of the reauthorizing legislation of that act. Section 333 allows for exemptions to our current regulations for unmanned aircraft to potentially operate commercially in our airspace. What an operator needs to do is come to the FAA and through Section 333 file an exemption application and define specifically how they're going to operate, where they're going to operate, and what function they're going to perform. The FAA looks at that, analyzes that, and if we see that that can be done safely, we grant an exemption for that operator to operate. I will tell you that that's a sort of a one-lane road into commercial applications of UAS, because the exemption process right now is basically the only avenue to get there for commercial users. We have something in the neighborhood of 6,700 applications that came in. I think we've approved something in the neighborhood of 2,700 or 2,800 applications for specific use of UAS in the commercial environment. We still have about 3,000 in the pile waiting to be processed. And as I said, it's kind of a one-lane road with a lot of people wanting to get in and get that approval, and we're doing the best we can to keep up with it. We found ways to streamline our processes and things like that. But the exemption process is very, very active and being used right now, and the only avenue for getting some of those approvals to use those UAS. So what the agency has focused on is drafting a small UAS rule, a small rule that would apply to unmanned aircraft systems. It's a rule that would apply to unmanned vehicles under 55 pounds. It defines what our requirements will be for unmanned aircraft, for airworthiness, and for pilot operator credentials. Because as I said, right now, if you're going to operate a UAS under today's rules, you have to have pilot credentials. Will that be the case in the future? Possibly not. Our rule suggests not, but the rule is still in draft. It opens the door for commercial use, and it addresses a lot of the things that you see happening out there right now with inappropriate use or unauthorized use of UAS. The rule will cover a lot of that when the rule gets put in place. It defines operating restrictions for aircraft and defines what can and can't be done, basically, in lower altitude airspace for appropriate and safe use of UAS. The status of that rule, the rule's been out for a while. It went out in draft for public comment. We got something in the neighborhood of 4,500 public comments. The FAA needs to work through all those comments and is doing that diligently, and ultimately we hope in the next few months to get that rule put in final form, which then needs to go forward for approval and ultimately implementation. It's very important to get that done because the small UAS rule starts to establish the necessary groundwork for managing and regulating how we safely operate UAS in our airspace. The other rule that I want to talk about is something that coincidentally did just happen yesterday, which was the announcement by our Secretary of Transportation of a rule requiring registration of small unmanned aircraft. And it did, literally yesterday it was announced. Again, that's registration of aircraft under 55 pounds, and it makes it registration requirement. And what it does is a couple of things. First of all, it gives the FAA the knowledge of who out there has UAS, who is authorized to use UAS, who will be flying UAS. It also identifies the aircraft with an identifying number that goes on the aircraft that's being flown. So it starts to give us some of the same types of information that we have regarding piloted aircraft, which all have to be registered and have a registration number on the aircraft and things like that. So it starts to duplicate that. Probably the biggest thing it does, it provides the FAA the opportunity to pursue the education piece very, very hard. If you are going to acquire a remotely controlled aircraft, what you're required to do under the rule is to register that aircraft before you put it in the air. So in part of the registration process, that allows you, that creates an interface between the FAA and the registrant, and it allows us to start to provide some of that education directly to those who are using UAS. The registration rule applies to those who are already using UAS in lower altitude airspace. They will have to register within a certain period of time, and anybody who gets a new aircraft, a new UAS will have to do the same. So these two rules together start to build that structure that mirrors our regulation of piloted aircraft. And there's a couple of quotes that came out in the press release yesterday, and I think they're very, very relevant here. So I'm going to quote our Secretary, Anthony Fox, who said, "Make no mistake, unmanned aircraft enthusiasts are aviators, and with that title comes a great deal of responsibility. I'm excited to welcome these new aviators into the culture of safety and responsibility that defines American innovation." And our FAA administrator, my boss, Michael Huerta, was quoted as saying, "We expect hundreds of thousands of model unmanned aircraft to be purchased this holiday season. Registration gives us the opportunity to educate these new airspace users before they fly, so they know the airspace rules and understand they are accountable to the public for flying responsibly." And I think those two statements sum up very well the importance of the registration rule, and we're very pleased to see that registration rule go into effect as of yesterday. So let me just close, and as I want to keep my comments short, our mission is to provide a safe and efficient aviation system in our country. And while we need to continue to safeguard the safety and efficiency of our system, and safety will always be priority number one, we also have to acknowledge that UAS is here, and the industry is growing, and the UAS will become a bigger and bigger factor and bigger part of our industry, of our system, as the UAS industry grows and moves forward. That's just the reality we're dealing with. So our task is to put those two pieces together to ensure that we embrace technology, we support the growth of commerce in our country, but that we also ensure that the level of safety that the American people have come to know and expect in our aviation system is never compromised. And we look forward to that challenge. And again, I want to thank you for the time to speak here, and I look forward to any questions anyone may have.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you have a question, okay. Mr. Cummings?
Yes. Do the rules and regulations cover privacy so that the drones don't just hover over by some open window someplace?
Privacy, yes. You did have that in the title, and I didn't address it here, so you're right. I need to. Privacy, it's interesting. It's one of those big policy issues, and it's an issue that was never, I guess I would call it a good fit for the FAA, because the FAA is largely staffed and oriented toward the technical aspects of aviation, how you fly safely, how you fly efficiently, how you get that done. President Obama issued a presidential memorandum not very long ago on the subject of privacy and how we're going to address privacy, and he actually assigned the lead to another agency, the National Telecommunications Information Agency, to take the lead in formulating privacy policy as it relates to the use of unmanned aircraft. And the FAA serves as a supporting player in that discussion. Certainly we control the airspace, so how it gets used and where people fly is part of what our responsibility is. But when you get into the technical aspects of privacy, the President has called upon others maybe more suited to deal with that issue, but it is not being ignored by any means.
Other questions?
Where does the 55 pounds come in? What's the logic behind that number?
Well, I'm looking at a colleague of mine, Mark Foisey, joined me. Mark, I call Mark my driver. He drove me down here. But what Mark really drives is F-16 jets and 767s and things like that. He's an aviator in the FAA and is our UAS lead. Does a lot of the front work with the users out there. So the standard, basically. Sorry to put you on the spot, Mark, but that one was one you could pick off.
Yeah, it's really an international standard, 25 kilograms, 55 pounds, and where they came up with that number, I think 25 is probably a round number. Most of the world uses metric, so that's sort of where they started. Other than that, other than the fact that it's an international agreement, I don't know any basis farther than that.
The line needs to be drawn somewhere. So.
Okay. Sir, with driverless cars coming along and technology advancing as fast as it is, do you foresee pilotless aircraft at any point in time, like a FedEx or something like that?
Well, you're really going to stretch my authority to talk about things like that, I guess. But you know, I think you look at technology and see what you see in the future. Unmanned aircraft is a small example of a bigger thing. On the military side, certainly there are much larger aircraft that are being remotely piloted as a UAS. So the technology is there to look at those things in the future. You know, I think culturally we need to move a little bit before we get to the point of all of us getting on board a pilotless aircraft. But the technology certainly lends itself to a glimpse at what the future looks like. So.
Other questions? Ma'am, do you have a question? Thought I saw another hand. Here we go.
I'm a property tax attorney, and I do a lot of instructing of local township assessors in Illinois and in other jurisdictions. And there's always this question of, hey, can we get a drone and fly it over some farmland? Because my job is to basically find the property and put it on the tax roll. And sometimes it's hard to find the property when it's located, you know, on a large piece of private property. Can you speak to what the legal situation is with somebody using this technology in that way?
Yeah, well, I will tell you that there's been a lot of interest in the real estate side of industry to use UAS for the very reasons you talk about. And I think one of the things that are relevant to that question is where are you flying? And in the case you're talking about, possibly you're flying over a lot of vacant land and things like that. The restrictions we have in place right now for operating UAS are largely tied to line of sight, which means you can only fly so high, you can only fly so far. And I didn't mention research, and I really should take a moment to talk about research because I missed that part. If you look at the future, there's a great deal of research going on right now into how to expand the capabilities of UAS and do it safely. Part of the reauthorizing legislation, the FAA established 6 test sites around the country, which are basically just labs for testing different capabilities of UAS in different climates and different environments and things like that. We also partner with specific industry partners to look at ways to expand the capabilities of UAS. All of that said, when you start to look at those things and you start to put those pieces in place, you get to be able to use UAS farther and farther away from the operator and do it safely. in the situation you're talking about, where you're talking about vacant properties and things like that, I do believe there's an application there. I think the small rule will start to small UAS rule will start to speak to that. We have some exemptions that have been granted to people under Section 333 to already do that type of thing. But it gets really specific right now for the agency to look at what is it you want to do, where do you want to do it, how far do you want to go, and does it pose any safety risk.
Back here. Mr. Yan.
I read in the paper that the budget is being discussed in Washington. How does the current budget deal impact the FAA and specifically what the rules you're talking about?
Well, let's see. The budget deal affects everybody, right? Everyone in government. I have said, and we had a conversation up here, I answered that, generally, I respect Congress's job. They have a very, very difficult task to get their arms around the multitude of issues and funding requirements that we have. I think that Congress has generally shown a significant amount of respect to the work that the FAA does and the contributions of aviation to our economy and commerce. And so I have confidence that they will see fit to fund things appropriately. They see the importance of things like UAS. They know that's, again, that's our economy. That's the future. So I'm optimistic, certainly, that in the budget deals that are reached in Washington, that the FAA will be adequately funded to do the things that need to be done to move things like UAS forward.
Okay. A question over here.
What do you feel are the key risks with drone use as far as applications, whether it could be something like terrorism or just, drones being in the way of aircraft and things like that?
Well, right now, I would say the key risk is again, I would call it irresponsible use of UAS. People using them in ways that they shouldn't be used, possibly without even knowing the risk that could be created by that. So flying in airspace that is too close to an airport, for instance, is something that's a basic educational thing we do. And I think if you're going to look at some immediate interests and needs we have, that's it. Making sure that people understand the rules and fly where they're supposed to fly, no higher and no farther, and avoid those conflicts that come up in the civilian airspace. One of the unique things about our system in the United States is we have a more robust general aviation population and activity level than many countries do. Lots of small aircraft, private pilots flying in our airspace at some lower altitudes, and that creates complexities. And we need to make sure that people who use UAS understand, as the Secretary said, that once they put something up in the air, they are aviators. They need to be responsible and understand the rules like everyone else.
Okay. The Section 33 exemption, typically, how long does that process take?
I will say it's a months-long process. I know that the FAA has tried to alter that as much as possible by coming up with some blanket approvals and things like that to streamline certain types of applications that start to look alike and operate in certain ways, that maybe with a blanket approval we can knock off a number of those. But an isolated application could certainly take a number of months to get through the process and come out the other side. We'd like to keep people informed. We want to make sure if people have an application in, if they stay in touch with us, we keep them informed of where it is. And we'd like to get everybody's application approved by tomorrow. But as I said, the demands are pretty high.
Can you describe, excuse me, can you describe the communications and relationship between the FAA and the drone manufacturing industry?
Yeah, I think in general terms, there's a substantial amount of collaboration and dialogue, and not always agreement, but certainly an ongoing, extensive amount of dialogue with industry. There are industry groups that represent the U.S. industry in general, plus individual manufacturers, and that dialogue between the FAA and industry is a daily dialogue. There's lots of issues to get our arms around, and lots of smart people out there that can help try and find the best solutions.